tuone itikadi nakala ya Septemba ambayo inauzwa kwa shilingi 500 au 1000 kwa wale ambao wanatupatia solidarity. Na katika itikadi ya Septemba kuna masuala mengi ambayo yanazungumziwa. Kosisi keleli Afrika malupakannya saupondolwayo izwa imitandazo yetu
Kosi sikelela tina lusapulwayo. Mungu ibariki Afrika, wabariki viongozi wake, hekima, umoja na amani. Hizi ni ngao zetu Afrika na watu wake. Kupigwa na kupokonywa maisha hakutatuzuia sisi wananchi kunyakuwa uhuru wetu na haki ya jasho letu. Comrade, I just did a couple of, it's one song actually, but 3 different, let me say, translations of the same song. So one is the South African national anthem, the other one is the Tanzanian national anthem, and the other one is what we call the Song of the Struggle, or here in Kenya, it's known as Wimbo wa Mapambano. So it's the alternative anthem to the Kenyan anthem. It's the anthem of the left and the anthem of the struggle. And you can see that it's one tune, but it's used by 6 countries across Africa, now including Kenya. There is Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Tanzania, South Africa for the national anthem, but in Kenya also as the alternative anthem. So we can see, Pan Africanism in this manner, in this small manner, but I'm sure as we go deeper, we are going to delve in further. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you're tuning in from, welcome to CPK TV, the voice of the people. My name is Sefu Sanni and I will be your host. And today we have a guest who I will let introduce himself to you. And without much further ado, welcome. And you can tell our viewers your name and where you're coming from and what do you do exactly? How do you organize, etc.? Well, first and foremost, thank you very much, Sefu. Good evening to you. Hello to your viewers wherever they are finding themselves. My name is Jonis Ghedi Alason. I am the coordinator of the work of the Pan Africanism Today Secretariat. It's a secretariat that was formed in 2016 following a series of meetings and debates among progressive organizations from the African continent who were saying that basically in order for us to benefit from the strength that we have collectively, we need to work together to unify and strengthen the struggles of the masses that are anti-capitalist and that are anti-imperialist. And with that in mind, there was a decision to create a secretariat that is tasked concretely with developing and executing programs that are in line with an overall objective of reviving and advancing a revolutionary Pan-Africanism. So I'm very happy to be here, to be able to talk more about not just our experiences, but also the experiences of yourself and your organization.
Thank you very much, Jonis. And so what kind of programs have you come up with as Pan-Africanism Today? Do you mind telling us a bit about, some of those programs? Do you have maybe youth programs or gender programs? Or what kind of programs has the Secretariat of Pan-Africanism Today been able to come up with so far?
So to answer your question, it's
might be easier to start with what was our kind of analysis of the conjuncture or the moment that we find ourselves in 2016 when we were starting this work. And again, I think it's important to note that it wasn't necessarily new ideas. Much of what we do was informed by the experiences that have come before us. So the song that you open today's discussion with is really a kind of anthem, not just of one country and one people, but it was really a kind of like aspirational song of the kind of world that we are hoping to create. So when the organizations convened in 2016, and they convened again not in a neutral context. This is in the wake of the kind of devastation that was caused after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. We were coming off the momentum of a very important meeting that took place in Brazil in 2015 under a theme of the dilemmas of humanity, where many of the core leaders of the organizations on the African continent were able to come together and recognize that not only do we need to start positioning ourselves collectively in a context where capitalism has clearly failed to provide solutions to the problems that humanity is confronted by, but also, and we almost have a much more difficult task in the African continent, of really trying to build and rebuild a unified left project. So what we recognized at the time was that there are a couple of limitations. One is that even though there are very important organizations in various parts of the continent who don't necessarily who are doing important work, we don't know one another. So one of the first tasks that was identified for a secretariat to start doing is to do, for lack of a better word, a kind of mapping exercise to try and understand who are the progressive formations in the various parts of the continent. I mean, it's a huge continent, but it had over decades been ravaged by structural adjustment programs. Many of our organizations have been almost confronted by a kind of onslaught, whether it takes the form of union bashing or police brutality, etc. So one task was that of this mapping exercise. The other task was a task of recognizing that ultimately it's the people and the organizations that they build that are going to affect the kind of change that we were hoping to see. And what does that mean? It means that really there's a necessity to capacitate the people that are not just rank and file members of organizations, but also mid-level cadre, leaders of the organizations, with two important principles. One is the principle that we need to go beyond criticizing the system, and we need to start articulating what it is that we are in fact fighting for. In other words, some kind of socialist agenda. And secondly, a recognition that the struggles and the challenges and the lessons that we must be learning from one another should not be inhibited by colonial borders established in 1884, and some concept of internationalism and Pan Africanism is necessary. So to concretely answer your question, we've been spending the last 6 years or so trying to identify and refine our understanding of not just the realities that are confronting the various parts of the African continent, but also what is the balance of forces in these countries and in these parts of the continent, who's who, and what are the struggles they're engaged in. And then we've been running a lot of political education programs, conferences that allow us to not just meet one another, but also start concretizing what are the elements of our common work going forward.
Thank you. And we'll get to the political education programs much later. So another thing I'd like to ask you is maybe to just delve in a bit into the Secretariat or the structure of PART. What does it consist of? Who are the members of the Secretariat? And, what kind of roles do they play in that structure for Pan-Africanism today?
Great. So the team that has been put together, and it really is, for lack of a better word, a motley crew of people who have come together because there was a recognition that the work that we needed to do and the objectives we need to advance require warm bodies to actually go and advance this. So in some instances, there are people who were effectively deployed by organizations. So organization X says, look, we are invested in this, so we're going to take one or two people and assign them to do this work in the day-to-day. Of course, there's some technical skills that are necessary for some of this kind of work. So we've been very slowly assembling a team. That team has over the years had slightly different areas of focus. So there have been moments where our focus is to try and have a kind of broad expansionist strategy to say, let's see how many people can we reach, how many organizations and countries and so forth can we learn from and pull into this common work, who will share this objective of reviving and advancing a revolutionary Pan-Africanism. But there was also moments where we felt that it's necessary to consolidate the gains that we had made. And we can talk a bit more about what these moments were, because they have affected how we have structured ourselves. Loosely speaking, there have always been people who are concretely assigned to things like political education work, media and communications work, cultural work, etc. But the kind of most recent iteration of the team has been that of having a group of people who is tasked with doing political education, both in kind of collective centralized spaces, but also to decentralize that team and go and engage and develop programs at the site of struggle of the various organizations. But also we convened what, to my knowledge, is the largest gathering of progressive formations outside of kind of the formal state institutions in the history of the continent. In 2018, more than 70 organizations gathered in Winneba, Ghana, and emerged from that meeting with a series of resolutions, which includes a recognition that the task of building Pan-Africanism has to also be continued at a sectoral level. What does that mean? It means that in addition to the broad common objectives we have, there's a task that we have to develop a common answer to the question of organized labor from a Pan-African perspective. Question of youth, the question of gender, question of land struggles, etc. So this has been part of how then the Secretariat ended up being organized, with some people concretely assigned to try and pull together the struggles of young people on the continent, as an example.
Thank you very much. And, when we're speaking of Pan-Africanism, one of the Pan-Africanists we have across Africa is Kwame Nkrumah, and you've mentioned Ghana, where this meeting of progressive happened and a couple of resolutions, were given. And in the year 1963, during the Organization of African Unity meeting, Kwame Nkrumah gave a speech basically to call upon the unification of the African people and Pan-Africanism, and for us as Africans to be able to operate without borders, as you're saying before. But also, the principle of Pan-Africanism is not just the purpose of unity because of skin color, but also when we speak about, consolidation of wealth of the African continent as a whole. What do you have to say about this speech then and its relation to Pan-Africanism now for the people of Africa?
No, look, this is a very important point, because there are many people who will characterize themselves as Pan-Africanists. So it is important for us to distinguish what is it that we have in common versus not. So I'll make one or two points briefly. One is that we know that this is an enormous continent. It has hundreds and thousands of languages, slightly different histories, cultures, etc. But there's also one experience that tends to unify us, which is less of a question of identity and more of a question of a very similar way in which the capitalist mode of production has come to engage us and this continent. So we share, in many ways, a common history when it comes to things like colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism, etc. They have slightly different tones to them. So the first point that is important to make is that the specific understanding of Pan-Africanism, that not just us in the Secretariat, but the organizations that have come to identify with this idea of Pan-Africanism have in common, is that this is not about trying to revive some kind of historic identity that we share, where we imagine that we all were the same. Mm-hmm. The point is to say we've had a common experience, and unfortunately, we are also confronted with very similar challenges. We are, across the continent, confronted by a complete disjuncture between the objective reality of how much wealth is available on the continent versus who benefits from it. Mm-hmm. So it's a Pan-Africanism that is fundamentally rooted in understanding that the material wealth of this continent has historically and continues to be the wealth that is benefiting a small elite group, most of them in fact based outside of the continent. Mm-hmm. So the call that Nkrumah was making at the time was a call that wasn't being made in a vacuum. It was a call that was being made in a context of a moment of decolonization where we had conquered some form of political power in many parts of the continent without corresponding economic power. And the Pan-Africanism that we are calling for today is a Pan-Africanism to conquer political and economic power for the vast majority of the people of the African continent who continue to have had the dream of liberation deferred since the 1960s, 1970s, 80s, 90s, and up until today.
Thank you very much for developing that. And even as we speak about Pan-Africanism, of course, I will take us back again to 1884. And a time like this in November, where we had the scramble and partition of Africa, mostly predominantly by the European states, of course, who came into Africa, and that was the beginning of the colonialism, that plundered Africa and exploited its natural resources, etc. And in one of Walter Rodney's books, he speaks about how Europe underdeveloped Africa and what exactly is development, because most of the time we only speak about development on an economic level, but there are many ways, for us to measure development and not just, the economic manner. But even if we are to look at the economic way of measuring development, then we see that there are a lot of countries in Europe that, we would call them more developed because probably they're more industrialized than the countries in Africa, whereas the countries which are quote unquote underdeveloped or developing nations are more agriculturally based. But we see that the biggest reason why these countries are what we call developing countries is because of the plunder, the exploitation, the colonialism, the neocolonialism, the imperialism that they have placed on the quote-unquote developing countries, like Africa. So we can see this disparity, whereas a continent like Africa, which is so rich, in terms of resources, then, it's being called a developing country, while a continent like Europe, which doesn't really have so much resources, is a developed state. And, one of the other biggest disparities is when citizens, or let me say non-citizens of other countries, own resources like lands and mines in those developing countries like Africa. What do you say about this issue of development in Africa vis-a-vis the countries that have already developed and how they have affected the development of Africa?
Look, so the argument that Walter Rodney made in that book about is that we cannot understand the development of and again, there are different phrases. Some call it the global north, the European countries, the colonizing countries. We know what we mean. But we cannot understand the so-called development of certain parts of the world and the so-called undeveloped or lack of development or underdevelopment in other parts of the world in isolation from one another. These are two sides of the same coin. This was basically his argument. And this remains entirely true. And it's not only a question of historically how has this unfolded. Because again, even before we talk about, there was an industrial revolution in England or in Europe that really made it at the cutting edge of the development of capitalism. But that industrial, it wasn't a kind of decision from above that this needs to happen in England. It is as a result of the enslavement of African people who were taken to the so-called New World to work themselves to death and generate absolute surplus value for the owners of capital and the means of production at the time, which fueled that industrial revolution. So historically, there is a fundamental connection between the development of certain parts of the world and the underdevelopment of others. And this remains true today. I mean, we are sitting here having this discussion in a context where there is, for the umpteenth time, a COP meeting. There's COP27 at the moment.
Yes.
A year ago, there was a huge COP26 meeting where we were effectively being told, not just in Africa, but in the global south, in Asia, in Latin America, and Africa, being told that, well, you should develop, but don't do it in the way that we did. Don't do it by burning fossil fuels. Don't do it by... Now, of course, we have to acknowledge that the fate of this planet, we are all affected by it. But the absolute hypocrisy of these imperialist countries to, for example, continue to burn fossil fuels, to be responsible for 87% of the carbon emissions that our atmosphere is able to take, and then want to lecture us about how they are going to, because they're already so far down this road, going to continue having the base load of their energy sectors be from things like coal, for example, and lecture us about how we should not develop in this part of the world. It is ridiculous. So it's not even only a historical problem, this is a contemporary problem as well. If we look at what are the kind of conditions that were written into the structural adjustment programs in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, much of it could be characterized as saying, don't tamper with the economy that was left in the African context in the post-colonial period. So don't create engineers and doctors and these kinds of things. Make sure that the people that are pushing wheelbarrows today are the descendants of the ones who pushed wheelbarrows yesterday. And this is ultimately, therefore, a continuation. So the point about the connection between development and underdevelopment is really important. And this is not an indictment of the working peoples in these global north countries, but it is a recognition to say that at the end of the day, when it was argued by Lenin at the end of 1916 that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, we have to have an appreciation of what imperialism means and what liberation from a capitalist system in its imperialist stage means to us on the African continent.
Thank you for, debunking that in that manner. And, of course, it's said that if you want to have somebody, to heal you of your ills or, to be able to become a good doctor, they need to study, for example, medicine for them to become a good doctor. And in the same manner, for Africa to be able to unshackle themselves or to unshackle ourselves, let me use that word, from the underdevelopment, from the neocolonialism, from the capitalist system, then there is a need for education and political education at that. And in the beginning, you spoke about, the kind of political education, that is undertaken by the Pan Africanism today in different ways. We see that there are different schools, to undertake such education, such as you have the Nkrumah School in South Africa, you have the Amilcar Cabral School, and you have one in Tunis whose name I don't know. So what is the importance of this political education, and especially, for the working class, for the proletariat, for the people who are the ones who are being exploited?
Mm-hmm. So I'll start by saying that these schools are following in a very long tradition that was really, and we owe a lot to our friends in the landless workers movement in Brazil, to our friends from the Cuban Revolution, there's a long history of a recognition that education and internationalism is really the two pillars on which the working class movement is able to continuously strengthen itself in the context of an enemy that is relentless. So and maybe a few words about what characterizes this education. There is really three defining traits of what constitutes this education in terms of content, form, and the kind of participants in these programs. The content, again, is always tailor-made and developed in dialogue with the organizations that are actually going to be the beneficiaries of these programs. But the thread that weaves it together is a recognition that in order for us to really be effective at changing the world, we must have a good understanding of that world. And that the best kind of method for understanding the world is offered to us by a kind of like scientific socialist orientation. So this is the content question. In terms of the form or the methodology of how these courses are conducted, we learned a lot from the teachings of people like Paulo Freire, who argued that in education, for it to be liberatory or emancipatory, it has to put the teacher and the students into a dialogue with one another. And therefore, the lessons that were learned, not just by Paulo Freire, this was taken forward by Amilcar Cabral, by Steve Biko, by many others. The kind of approach or the methodology of the program has to be one that is able to say that learning is not something that happens just in one dimension. It's multiple dimensions through dialogue. And lastly, that we benefit not only from having very carefully designed curricula and very good facilitators who are able to kind of, through dialogue, teach people, but that ultimately those engaged in struggles are able to also learn from one another. So there has to be, in terms of the composition of the participants, it has to go beyond just one or two organizations, but a recognition that unions, parties, social movements, etc., from various parts of the world and the continent have something to learn from sitting together. So this is the kind of approach that we have taken to education, and that has been a very important kind of anchor for the work that we need to do, because it allows people to in the first instance, not feel lonely and isolated. I mean, sometimes the work that we do can become debilitating and difficult. So you feel a sense of genuine, concrete solidarity. But you are also learning, you are doing what Karl Marx argued we should be doing in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, where he said that philosophers have interpreted the world and the point is to change it. So these schools are about giving us the tools to simultaneously interpret the world and position ourselves to be able to make the kind of interventions that will change it.
All right. And, when we speak about education, I want to mention that there's a big distinction between studying and reading, where there's the, conveying of ideas, but there's also, the raising of the levels of consciousness. And in the Communist Manifesto of 1948, which was written by Karl Marx and Engels, they speak about organizing, the working class as a class for itself, first of all, and to defeat the supremacy of the bourgeoisie, and also to conquer the political power of the working class. So we see that you can learn and educate yourself even without being able to read. And now this brings me to also the illiteracy levels that we have in Africa. For example, Kenya is has one of the highest illiteracy levels, in Africa, unfortunately. And we were speaking earlier about, the copper belt of Zambia, which also has the highest illiteracy levels. And this is just an example, when we're speaking about the amount of wealth in that area, they have copper and it's used for manufacturing and, many other things. But these people are suffering from illiteracy. So how then can we undertake, this political education in a manner that it can encompass all the strata of society, and especially the strata of the working class, and including the illiterate, because they would need to study, for them to be able to have a raised level of consciousness, to be able to liberate themselves, and fight against the bourgeoisie and take up the political power.
So I think the first thing that we should recognize is we need to position education in what is the purpose, what is education? Because there's sometimes an error we make where we assume that education is neutral. Unfortunately, this is not the case, because the point that, at least this is our view of how do we understand education. Education under no circumstances is neutral education, because, and we've kind of, those of us who've had the opportunity to be able to study these kinds of questions will have come across this kind of distinction between what we call a base and a superstructure. That there's a base which is economics, and what you have not won in the base, you're not able to win in the superstructure, which is politics. So the things like education form part of a superstructure. Yes. They emerge from the concrete material conditions in the base, and they also reinforce that base. What does this mean? It means that an education system that is designed, it doesn't come from nowhere. The education system, when we go to school, why are we going to school? We go to school, there's a bell that rings at 7 o'clock, we must sit down, we must ask the teacher whether they were allowed to go to the bathroom or not. We get taught what we need to. It's really about disciplining us to go and become effective contributors towards the capitalist mode of production. Because my teacher is one day going to be my boss, who also will give me permission about whether I'm allowed to go to the bathroom or not, who I'm not allowed to talk back to, I must raise my hand, etc. So the first thing we should recognize is that the bourgeois education system, whilst of course there are concrete skills that are needed, the kind of ideology that informs it has to do with reinforcing the existing economic structure, which means that education in most African countries is about creating people who are going to be able to either contribute towards the exploitation of the African continent or get out of the way of the people who are doing it. It's about creating an either docile or active group of people who are able to make sure that the exploiters can exploit in peace. So where do we come in? We come in with a recognition to say that if we want to change the world and we want to give power to the people, then our approach to education has to be fundamentally liberatory. It's about liberation. It's about liberation of the individual, of the collective, and of the class as a whole. And therefore, the commitment to dialogue is not just because we like the ideas of Paulo Freire or because it's a more effective way of teaching people, but also because it's a commitment to say that it's the agents of history are the people who are going to be able to take these ideas and test them in practice, and then to organize, to educate, to multiply themselves, and take head on the challenges that we are confronted by. So this is broadly our assessment of what education can do. It's a tool, it can be a tool either in the hands of the oppressor or the oppressed. And our choice consciously is to say that it can't be neutral, and it has to be made an instrument for sharpening the people's movements and organizations internationally.
Thank you very much for tackling that question. And as I move forward, we see a clear distinction of class struggle in Africa, especially when we start from the apartheid regime in South Africa and, gaining your independence in 1994. We clearly see, the class struggle coming out, from that apartheid regime. But more than that, even if we fast forward to now, and not just in South Africa, but even if we're relating to other countries in Africa, including Kenya, we see the decline or, absolute, absolute ignorance, let me say, of the state or of the leadership on socio-economic rights of the people. And I think earlier on you were speaking about the Marikina massacre of 2012 in South Africa, where police shot mine workers who were living right under, platinum, and they lacked basic socio-economic rights like toilets. But underneath their feet there was wealth, and decisions are being made to keep the poor and for the rich to continue being rich. And even in Kenya, when you look at it today, well, maybe we have made a few strides in, civil political rights, including from 1992, the having a multi-party, democracy, and also the dispensation of our new constitution, etc. But when it comes to, the socioeconomic rights of the people, and even if it is embedded, in the constitution of the country, we've not been able to attain any of that, and the right to education or higher education, we've just spoken about education, which, all citizens should be able to have, and other rights like, just nutrition, basic nutrition for the people, the house to decent living, water and sanitation. These are basic human rights that we have not been able to attain, in Africa across the globe. Why do you think this continues happening in Africa, and how can we, totally liberate ourselves from such a state where people don't even have basic human rights, like socioeconomic rights?
I think this really goes to the heart of the question that we are confronted by. And I think we have to be upfront that this is not a question that has obvious and easy answers. But I'll share what has been the synthesis of some of our kind of evaluations on this question. One is that I think we have to start by recognizing that the system of colonialism, which did have slightly different faces, but really the same essence, was an extremely violent and brutal system in whatever parts of the continent that it kind of reared its ugly head. And we therefore have to celebrate the breakthrough that was possible by ending colonialism, at least formal colonialism. And of course, so ours is not to argue that, nothing has changed and it hasn't. What we are saying is that we have not taken, whilst the first step was to gain independence, to have our own flags, our own national anthems, to have the right to elect and select our own leaders. This was an important breakthrough and it must be celebrated. But we have to also recognize that people cannot eat flags and national anthems. So the struggle at the time was a struggle that wasn't in the first instance about appearances. It was about substance. It was about what Amilcar Cabral said about we are not fighting for ideas in anyone's head. We are fighting for real improvements to the lives of people. So, and it's that second part that has not yet happened. So the political breakthroughs, whether they were in 1963 in Kenya or 1994 in South Africa or 1980 in Zimbabwe, all of these have been important moments. And what made those moments possible across the board? It wasn't one or two individuals who fought for freedom. Freedom in Africa, that democratic breakthrough, the end of formal colonialism, was possible because of the organized masses of people coming together under a single banner of saying enough is enough. And therefore, we should not be tricked into thinking that there's one or two individuals who gave us freedom. It's not Kenyatta or Mandela who gave South Africa and Kenya their freedom as individual messiahs of the people. Rather, it was the people who organized themselves. And our view is that that the only effective time where we've been able to make these kind of breakthroughs is when the people were organized for a common agenda. And that common agenda at a certain time was to end formal colonialism. But we also have to heed to the text that Nkrumah wrote, I think in 1967 or something like that, where he said neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Because we are confronted with a situation where we have political power but no economic power. And how do we gain that economic power? This is the core question. And here our view is that what has not failed us in the past was when the people convened and organized among one another under a single banner. And this has to happen again. For us to say that we cannot leave it up to politicians and individuals and messiahs to deliver some kind of revolution. Rather, it is our task to say, we will not allow a situation where the vast majority of the continent's of the world's platinum reserves are sitting in South Africa, and we are going to allow the continuation where the people who are living above it must be living in squalor. This cannot continue. And that kind of principled stance around which we can then build an agenda and mobilize and organize is the task that we have given ourselves. And it's not a task that the Secretariat has given itself, it's a task that the people's movements and organizations have given themselves.
Speaking about socioeconomic rights of the people, and one of the rights I mentioned was the right to an education. And for example, and not just post-secondary education, which of course is important, but elementary education and secondary education as well. And of course, the type of education you have also determines, and especially in this part of the world, the type of employment that you get. And for example, in Kenya, we have an unemployment rate, and especially for young people, which is standing at 40%. That is, quite huge. And I'm sure in South Africa as well, and especially being a rainbow nation, the unemployment rates are high as well for the young people, but also, maybe for the people of color and, the Indians, as we move up the scale, the percentages keep getting smaller and smaller. And with this, we've seen a lot of privatization of state corporations. Education being one of the things that is, privatized as a social amenity for the people. But we've also seen communications, being privatized. We've seen transport, for example. In Kenya right now, there's a big outcry because of the national airline, Kenya Airways, which has been run by the state, but it's being run down for it to be, privatized. And we've seen many other things as well. In South Africa, we've seen the South African Airlines, the rail and transport. What is your take on the issue of privatization, of these state corporations? And do you think that this privatization is something that should continue? And does it benefit, the working class or the common people? Or if not, who exactly does it benefit, and how does it advance the class struggle?
So I think there's 2 points that are really important to make here. The first is that what is the fundamental difference between privatized and public ownership of things? It's that they have fundamentally different objectives. Because when something is owned by the people as a whole, and it is maybe the state is the custodian of this national asset, whether it is the energy grid or the airline or whatever the case might be, the motive of the objective, what we measure its success by, is by the degree to which it is useful and beneficial to the people. So, for example, if you have a national grid for energy supply, and that thing is owned by the people, and the state is tasked with being the custodian of this national asset, the objective, when at the end of a financial year, what we will measure its success by is to say, to what extent did this deliver affordable, reliable supply of electricity to the people, as an example. The motive, when it is privatized, is completely different. When the energy sector is privatized, at the end of a financial year, what it gets measured by is by how much profit it was able to make. And therefore, you are always going to have a fundamental contradiction between these kind of national assets being privatized, which is a concrete, this is something that's happened all over the world, where there's been attempts, and again, there's a playbook to this. It gets slowly defunded, it gets made to be in a crisis. When it's in a crisis, then they say, well, maybe this private sector should step in. Then it gets auctioned off to the highest bidder. The private sector steps in, and then it starts using what was actually an asset of the people that it has gained at a laughable cost to generate revenue for a small group of individuals. But the effect of that always has been, it has not been more reliable, it has not been more efficient, it has not increased the access to that particular good, whether it's electricity or communications or transport or whatever, and it has created the conditions where the investments that have been made over years by the people into these assets and into that infrastructure gets used for the private accumulation of wealth. And suddenly things become 3-4 times as expensive. It becomes possible only for a small group of people to benefit from it. So the question of, is there any social value to the privatization of these state-owned entities? Absolutely not. And who benefits? Often the very same people who have benefited from all the other forms of exploitation and oppression that our countries are confronted by. So if there's one thing that, we cited earlier the speech by Nkrumah at the Organisation of African Unity. A few years later, Thomas Sankara came to the same Organisation of African Unity and made a clarion call for us to really come together against the debt that the African continent is being confronted by. In a similar way that he was making that clarion call against the kind of subjugation of the African continent through debt, we should be making a clarion call to say that the assets of the people should belong to the people and should be run properly and efficiently, and privatization is not and has never been and will never be the answer.
Thank you. So socialism is about, giving people dignity and not making them dependent on anyone. And most of these problems we're seeing, one is because of, dependency basically on our debtors in Africa, which are mostly the quote-unquote developed countries that we've spoken about earlier. And we're seeing many other problems, in Africa, like food security as well, and some of the issues that we have tackled. But most of these issues, as much as they're socio or economical, they can be solved politically if, of course, we have good leadership, if we remove the privatization of these state corporations, if we're able to end this exploitation, between the classes. And as such, that is why we have this class struggle, so that we get to have the dictatorship of the proletariat, who are the majority, in any country. And we've seen different political formations come up in regions in Africa, like the South African Communist Party, which is one of the oldest, communist parties, which is more than 100 years now. And of course, we've seen the Communist Party of Kenya, Communist Party of Sudan, Southern Sudan, and many other of such formations. My question to you is on some of the communist parties that we've seen who have quote unquote collaborated with other political parties that are not leftists, probably they're nationalist parties or even right-wing parties. Do you think this is a class conciliation, and in what way should the communists deal with such things happening? Like we also saw in the Communist Party of Kenya, where some of our former members collaborated with some right-wing fundamentalists?
Oh, so it's a hard question, so I'll do my best. I think there are, again, a couple of points. One is that what defines a communist party or a communist organization, and I would even be a bit broader with this, any kind of progressive revolutionary organization, is number one, it has some kind of objective in mind. Where are we going? What is the end game that we have here? And really here, the communists have always had the most clear and articulate picture of where is it that we're going. We're going to socialism. And socialism, I know this has become a swear word in some parts of the world. But really what socialism is what you are describing. It's about what we are saying, these socio-economic rights of people. It's about dignity. It's about basically being decent. It's not decent that when we were walking in some of the parts of Nairobi a few days ago, that sewage is people have to step over sewage to get to school. That's what children have to do. Mm-hmm. I mean, what decency is there in that? What dignity is in that? So what socialism is to say, if we have the technology and the skills and the capacity to deal with the sewage better, why can we not do that? Do we really have to say that the market will dictate whether or not you have to step over sewage in order to get to school? This doesn't seem like a rational position. So I want to kind of demystify what this socialism is. Socialism is about decency, about dignity, and the communists have always had a good picture of what is that end goal. Now, in order to get there, the task is to really do two things. One is to have a correct and sophisticated analysis of the material conditions within which we are engaged. So therefore, there's no blueprint that says, here's step 1, step 2, step 3 towards socialism. This, if it were that easy, we would have all had it already. Mm-hmm. The real task is to study and understand what are the concrete realities, what is a concrete analysis of the concrete conditions that we find ourselves in. So this is the first one. And then to say, if we know what is the concrete analysis of the concrete conditions of where we are today, and we know where we want to end up with decency, with dignity, with socialism, then the task becomes that of saying, what are the strategies and tactics that we need to employ in order to get from point A to point B? This is a simple kind of simplification of what is the task of any progressive people's organization, including communists. Now, there have always been times where there is a tactical benefit in making certain kind of alliances. There is a strategic benefit in trying to pull certain groups in and not others. So that can we sit here and say there is a blanket rule that says that is always good or it's always bad? That, I think, is going to be very difficult to do because we cannot speak for the concrete conditions within which each of these organizations is operating. But what we can say is that there is a responsibility that organizations have to, at every step of the way, to sit down and re-evaluate through criticism and self-criticism whether or not we are still on the right path. And what is the right path? The right path is the one of saying that there's only two camps in the world that exist in this political struggle: a people's camp and an enemy camp. And there's a question we have to ask: are we advancing the interests of the people's camp in this particular tactical or strategic move that we are making? And here I do think we have to be willing to be humble enough to say that sometimes we've gotten things right and sometimes we've gotten things wrong. Mm-hmm. And communists, leftists, progressives have at times stubbornly doubled down on what was really a kind of decision that you can quote it as you want. It is not really advancing the interests of the primary constituency whom you are trying to be a spear and a shield for. And this is, I think, an unfortunate reality. And our task would be to continue to try and persuade those people who seem to have not taken a step back and made an assessment of, are we on the right path here? To get them to understand that, comrades, there's more we should be doing to advance the interests of the people's camp. And this particular choice such as the choice to form unstrategic alliances that seem to be only beneficial to some individuals and not to the class as a whole, is not beneficial. So can we come back and reevaluate? So that would be my attitude in relation to this question, whether in South Africa or Kenya or anywhere.
Thank you very much, Jonis. And as leftists, I would say that one of the things that we really fight for, is for the rights of the proletariat and the working class. And the issue of, migrants in different countries is something that is very rampant. We've seen it here in Kenya, where because of the unemployment rates, the people, and out of desperation, they would seek jobs in other countries such as, the Middle East, where the treatment of the workers there is below humane. But also in the South, we've seen that a country like Zimbabwe, with all the crises that it's facing, has one of the highest literacy levels that we have in Africa. But with the crisis that is going on in the country, then there are a lot of migrants, who come into South Africa to seek employment. And of course, there's the issues of being underpaid because they don't have papers, or just, because they're coming from a foreign country. And of course, a lot of other foreigners who come into South Africa, as one of the highest economies in Africa. It is understandable. But, there have been issues of xenophobia in South Africa that are very rampant. And to some extent, people have to hide, or they cannot undertake, certain activities, people who are not of South African descent. Why do you think that, these attacks of xenophobia happened? What is informing this xenophobia in a country such as South Africa, which, had to fight so much, to get its independence? But more than that, how do you think this can be solved, in South Africa? Because it's a big issue plaguing, the country.
No, it is a huge issue. And I think we have to, we started our conversation by discussing what do we mean by Pan Africanism. And I think we should answer this question of xenophobia by coming back to what is a Pan-African answer, a response to this. Mm-hmm. But I want to take a few steps back. One is, no one becomes a migrant worker because that is their first choice. No one leaves the country of their birth, their family, their friends, to go and trek across the world. This is as a result of not having any possibility to socially reproduce yourself there where you are based, and a necessity to go and look for the capacity to go and socially reproduce yourself. And here, on that point, we have to ask, why is it that people have to even go and look for work somewhere else? The reason is, and we don't even have to start with Africa. Today we are confronted in Europe with a rise of the right. We just had the inauguration of a right-wing prime minister in Italy, and this is across the board. What is this a response to? It's a response to the so-called migrant crisis of people coming here. Why is there a migrant crisis? Because for 20 years, the Middle East has been bombed to smithereens by the imperialist forces. Iraq has been flattened. Afghanistan has been flattened. Syria, there's a crisis that is Yemen. We don't have. Libya has been destroyed by NATO. The same NATO that is now wanting to introduce no-fly zones over Ukraine, etc. So we have to. And then what happens? There is no capacity in those countries for the people who live there to reproduce themselves. And what do? They then have to pack a bag and start looking for work somewhere. And suddenly there's now a kind of like scapegoating of the people who are coming as a consequence of Germany funded the bombing of Afghanistan. And then there is a complaint in Germany when people from Afghanistan are showing up as economic refugees, effectively, or as migrant workers. So this is a kind of, I'm trying to say that we have to have a kind of broad perspective of this. The South African economy. Today, more than half of all the gold that exists above the ground comes from a very small part of South Africa known as the Witwatersrand. Who took that gold out of the mines? Who made it possible to dig deeper mines in South Africa than anywhere else in the world? It was the apartheid system that was structured around the super exploitation of black and African labor. But it was also not limited to people who are today confined to the boundaries of South Africa. There's a beautiful song written by Yuma Sekela, a very important musician in South Africa, about the train that used to basically run throughout the entire SADC region, picking up workers from Malawi, from Zimbabwe, from Zambia, from Mozambique, to come and work in those mines. So the first point that we need to recognize is that the South African economy has always depended on migrant labor. Secondly, there would have been an expectation, especially in the South African context, where we have been the beneficiaries of the support from the frontline states in Zambia and Mozambique and Angola, who were able to help us in South Africa make the democratic breakthrough in 1994, that we would take a more Pan-Africanist, internationalist attitude when it comes to our brothers and sisters from across the African continent. But what did we see? We saw that instead of taking what was even then one of the most developed economies on the African continent and turning it into a beacon of the kind of economic structure that is possible on the continent, we went and negotiated in the context of the so-called end of the Cold War for self-imposed structural adjustment programs. We took the decision to say, let's take South Africa and make it the kind of example for neoliberalism. We're looking for foreign direct investment. The state has no business in business. This is the kind of attitude we took. So there's a beautiful poem by Langston Hughes where he talks of the dream deferred. The dream of liberation in South Africa was deferred. The dream of 1994 was deferred. And then when today we are confronted with a youth unemployment rate of 74%, and we are confronted by extreme levels of inequality, of poverty, of unemployment in South Africa, you then find a scapegoating of the very same people whose fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers were responsible for building the South African economy. Suddenly we are saying that the reason why there's challenges in South Africa is because of all of these foreigners. These foreigners, A, built the country, B, why they are there in the first place is because of the imperialist aggression on the African continent as a whole, and thirdly, where we must be looking for the blame for the challenges that are confronting our country cannot be with a small minority of economic refugees. It has to be with the decisions that were taken to take a neoliberal path rather than a people-centered path towards economic development in South Africa.
Thank you, Jonis. And I think one of the ways in which, the workers, whichever workers, the migrant workers and just the working force of a country can fight for themselves is through trade unions, and cooperatives. And we've seen a lot of collaborations, even in South Africa, of the trade unions and some of the, left political parties, even in the past. So as the Communist Party of Kenya, of course, being both a vanguard and a mass organization, we have a political education, and we also run a school of ideology, which, we run within the party. And for the liberation of the working class as well, it is extremely important to work with the trade unions. But that is something that we have not achieved fully here from the Communist Party of Kenya. One, because mainly the organization, which is the central organization of trade unions, is largely state-owned. As such, organizing outside the state is a bit difficult. So, we have to find, the trade unions or help form them and then, train them into cadres. Vis-a-vis maybe the work that you've done in South Africa or that you're doing, with the trade unions and the political organization, linking them with the political work. Maybe tell us about that and how, this can be a solution, especially for these, migrant workers and workers at large.
No, thank you very much. And I think this is an important question. We sometimes forget that there's a task that we have, not just of trying to have the right analysis and strategy, but ultimately we have to also understand where are the instruments of working class power that are being built and that already exist. So on trade unions, and perhaps for context, I mean, the week before I was here, we were privileged to participate in a very important milestone program where the Trade Unions Congress in Ghana, together with all its leadership and the socialist movement there and the leadership of the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa and some others, was able to spend a week grappling with some of these questions that are confronting organized labor and what is the role of trade unions in the political struggle. I mean, this is an important question. And I actually want to respond to your question by trying to summarize what were some of the conclusions there, because I think that they are applicable beyond South Africa and Ghana. I think they apply beyond. So firstly, look, a trade union's primary task is that of collective bargaining. It's the task of saying that the people who are working in a factory or in a plant or wherever they are working have interests, and they have those interests in common. And there are attempts to divide them and make sure you kind of negotiate with each of them separately. And therefore, what we should, in the first instance, be measuring trade unions by is their ability to confront the bosses or the capitalists or the exploiters head on in the interests of their members. So the first thing that we would want to say is not necessarily that we want communist trade unions, but we want independent trade unions that are able to say that the thing that they are going to wake up every morning doing is to defend their members. So this is the first step. The second debate that is important is to say that, of course, once we have conquered that first responsibility of defending the material interests of the members of the trade union, we then have to start saying, well, our members in the trade union are not just individuals in a vacuum. They have families, they have communities. So they are, what's the point of having a great trade union, but then you still have to go home to go live in squalor and to go deal with your many unemployed relatives and so forth. So a union, even though its primary task is to basically defend the interests of workers in a capitalist system where they are exploited, it cannot stay out of the political struggles altogether. And here, I think there are a couple of points that are important. We know that there's always a risk that unions have of kind of becoming very close to the state, where they become almost the labor desk of the government. Now, sometimes that is, if you have a progressive government, that might be an effective way of organizing yourself. But the point that I made earlier in relation to communist parties, I think applies here to trade unions as well. Because there are moments where we must step back and say, to what extent is this kind of cozy relationships that we have with ruling parties, with governments, etc., in the interests of our membership and our base. So we have to recognize a couple of things. One, trade unions remain the prime mass organization of the workers. And there are other important mass organizations, but a trade union is definitely one of them. So strong, independent trade unions that are effectively defending and advancing the interests of their members is our primary goal. And anything we can do to foster that kind of militant independence and follow through, we should do. Secondly, in the context where no worker is a worker 24/7. They all clock in and they clock out. And when they clock out, they go back into the same society that continues to be ravaged by all kinds of social ills that are brought on by capitalism. So in that context, the task of a union is to position itself beyond the very limited economic struggles of the workers and position itself to be able to be on the right side of history when it comes to the broader political struggles. And here there are campaigns, again, I mean, we have across the continent a dire escalation of the cost of living. It has become exceptionally expensive just to get to work and back or to prepare food. So where is organized labor in that question? because this is not just a question for the housewife that suddenly is paying 3-4 times as much as we did before for cooking oil. This is also a question for all of us together. So this is what I would say in relation to unions. There's a responsibility that we have, I think, to try to persuade and engage any trade union to, in the first instance, maintain a loyalty to its membership, and in the second instance, to be willing to work with us on the political questions that are confronting our people. And this has happened in the past. Many of the breakthroughs that we've discussed so far were the consequence of organized labor throwing its weight behind the people. And here I think that there's no reason why that cannot happen again. And that would be the appeal that we should, I think, make to the unions and the people that are privileged to hold leadership at all levels of trade unions.
Thank you very much. In your visit to Kenya, we were able, at least for the period of time, we've been with you, we were able to see, two types of organizing. One being the urban organizing and also the rural and peasant organizing, in Kenya. And, with the urban organizing, of course, through the Communist Party of Kenya, we're able to see at least a bit of the political organizing on the left of a vanguard party, but also some of the mass movements that, we work with, like the social justice centers. We were in Dandora, social justice, and also in Madare, social justice. Thank you very much, Dandora Social Justice Center, for hosting us. And we were happy to be there in Madare, Social Justice Center as well. And in our visit, of course, we were able to see, this mass organizing in the city, and the collaborations we can also have on the left. And I'm sure you were in on the conversations where sometimes, of course, we've been able to collaborate on some issues, but of course, in others, we've had, an antagonistic relationship, especially when it comes to events such as the Saba Saba, where maybe we have, small issues like propaganda material, etc. What would you say about this? And I'll ask this in two phases. One is the internal one for Kenya, but the other one is external for the whole of Africa. So you could answer the twofold one. So how do you think that we can come together as, the left organization, whether it's vanguard and, mass movements, for us to be able to fight against this common enemy? But also when it comes to the continent, probably now, you spoke about the mapping that you've been doing as Pan Africanism today, of the different organizations. And it would be good to bring all these organizations together in one way, maybe through the media and communications, like the way we have this channel. And I'm sure in Tanzania, we have the Viwata, a radio station at Viwata. We have Pan Africanism TV in Ghana. How do we now consolidate this maybe around media for us to be able to have a stronger left, a stronger network that, works together and can be able to identify certain, issues across the continent that affect us all and have common points of convergence?
Sure. So I'll start with the first one. I think it is, and this is always, it's a negotiation and it's a process. How do we work with people with whom we have some things in common and some things not? And this goes both ways, because the point here is and here I think there's a degree to which we have to be willing to have what I would call some level of political maturity, because just like I would presume that for the Communist Party of Kenya, there are certain things that they will agree with when in their relationship with a social justice center, and certain things that they would do differently, and vice versa. So the maturity comes with saying that, look, we have this particular point in common. Let's set aside whatever the areas are that we don't agree on, and let's make this a useful intervention. And let's draw on one another's strengths. If it is possible for, hypothetically, the Social Justice Center has a really good way of articulating the real needs of the people, then let's allow them to do that. if the Communist Party has a very good capacity for historicizing and theorizing where the challenges that we are confronted by are coming from, then let's allow them to do that. So on that point, I think it is a kind of challenge, and it was evident in the time here. And we also know, I mean, this has also to do sometimes with the pressure that people are under from different quarters. We know that organizations find themselves under pressure because it's less about the actual substance of what are we protesting about in the Sabasaba march, and more about, well, some of our friends or our partners or our funders are not going to be very happy if they see us hand in hand with this or that group. Mm-hmm. So those kind of dynamics we have to be sensitive to. But I would say that based on what I have seen, there is more that the progressive forces in Kenya have in common and what unites them than what divides them. So the task here is about saying, what is the 4, 5, 6% that we can all agree on? And let's do that together, because ultimately we're going to be judged by history if we fail to do that. So this is the kind of first element. And I think that point is broadly applicable throughout the continent. I mean, I keep arguing for Pan Africanism, but this is not a denunciation of the diversity and the differences and that exist on the continent. So the task is less about saying, let's all be the same. Let's all dress the same, have the same food, no, that's not the point. Let's celebrate whatever differences exist among us that are able to improve and nuance and humanize us, because no human is just homogeneous. But let's identify what is the 1% that brings us all together. What is the 1% in our experiences, in our analysis? And these are the things that I think my view would be that there's a task that we have to basically set aside any prejudices that we might have in order to commit ourselves fully to find that 1% or 5% that unites us. Which brings me to the second part of your question. Mm-hmm. And I think here there's a need to kind of take almost a step back in relation to your question around media and so forth. When in 2004, Fidel Castro made a really powerful speech where he argued, and again, it wasn't the first person to argue this, but he kind of popularized the phrase of the battle of ideas, to say that what we are engaged in here, the fight for a new world, is not just a fight for the concrete material benefit for today or the path to socialism and all the things we've discussed about. One of the terrains of struggle is the terrain of ideological struggle. What do I mean by this? Why is it that young people sometimes cannot imagine a world that isn't capitalist? There's a phrase, some statistic, and I think comes out of the United States, that it is easier for people to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. That is a failure of the imagination. And this is a failure of us to successfully contest at the level of the battle of ideas. So, and it's a similar thing in Africa. And the task, therefore, is to really do two things. One is to elevate and to celebrate and lift up the analyses, the experiences, the concrete realities of the majority of the people of the continent and the organizations that they have built. And this is a real thing. I mean, it sounds like a low-hanging fruit and it might sound obvious sitting here. But if I were to ask the viewers just in a kind of riddle, who are the kind of key political parties in Congo at the moment, many people will not know. So one of the tasks is really just to say, can we create a space where it's possible to elevate the struggles of the people and their analyses and their experiences to the point where we know more about one another. And this to me would be partially an antidote to things like xenophobia, because suddenly you recognize in your brother from Burundi yourself. So that's one task, is really just to lift up the concrete reality. It's more, we have 1.2 billion people on the continent. What are the realities there? Most people can tell you what is happening in the US, because the US has been extremely efficient at engaging in the battle of ideas. Movies we watch, music we listen to is informed by that. The second task that we have in this battle for ideas, in addition to lifting up the experiences, the realities, is to articulate our vision for the future. Because we cannot continue to have this kind of failure of the imagination that has characterized the last couple of decades. What is the future? What is a more humane and dignified future? Can we paint a picture, not just for ourselves, but for the people who have been led to believe that the crisis that we are in is just the alpha and the omega of our world? And this is something that also has to happen. So on that front, I would argue that there's two really important components to that. This battle of ideas, which is absolutely crucial. One is what I would call media and communications, because it is necessary for us to make sure that progressive forces in South Africa have access to what I've been privileged to see over the few days that I was here. And we cannot bring everyone here to see it. So there's a task that we have to communicate that, to package it in a way that people can understand, that is beautiful, that is well put together, and that the stories and the realities and the analyses, not just of CPK, but of the progressive formations in Kenya and in East Africa, are easily accessible to their counterparts throughout the continent and the world. So the media question is important. And here I think it is a matter of saying, can we take the kind of platforms that exist and work together on generating input and content for those platforms? But the other thing that has really warmed me on the inside while I was here is what I saw when it comes to revolutionary art and culture. Because even this discussion, most people will find this discussion a little bit boring. But there are people who would really appreciate a song or a rap or a dance that tries to interpret what is the essence of what it is that we are discussing here. What is Pan Africanism? No one wants a long lecture with diagrams and graphs, but maybe they do want a beautiful song about it. So the task of elevating and developing a revolutionary working class culture that is grounded in the history and the experiences of the African continent and its aspirations for the future is really important. So I think on that note, it is, I think, one area, and this is not a task for this or that organization. I think there's a task for us to take seriously the terrain of the battle of ideas. Because if we are not able to do that, we're going to be stuck in a kind of pessimism where we have a crisis and some kind of view that, what can we do? And the truth is there's a lot we can do, and it's our task to illuminate what that is.
Thank you very much, Comrade, for your time and, for being able to just speak on those issues with us. And I don't know whether you have captured this, in your previous answer, but generally, what has been your experience of Kenya so far, from the expectations you had coming here and, yeah.
No, so I have had, and I'm halfway. This has been my first time really being able to spend some time in Kenya with the people. I have to appreciate the very generous hosting that has so far I've been able to receive here. I've been able to see people engaged in real work in the rural areas, in the western part of the country, in the urban areas in Nairobi. I have taken away many lessons, not only for myself and for the Secretariat, but also for the organizations that I will be able to spend time with in the coming weeks and months. It's clear to me that Kenya is a very important country. And it is important both for the progressive forces, but also for the forces that want to exploit the continent. So there is a degree to which some of the challenges that we've come across are not an accident. They are the consequence of the active disorganizing of the forces that can offer resistance to the exploitation, not just of the people of Kenya, but the people of East Africa and Africa more broadly. So, but whilst it is true that we always have challenges wherever we are, I think so far I take a lot of inspiration from what we have seen here, because it is important to come here and to see that in spite of the challenges and the limitations and the setbacks that we suffer from time to time, the phrase that had been popularized throughout the liberation movement of a luta continua, that the struggle continues. To come here and to see that the struggle continues, and not just that it continues, but that it is continuing in new and fresh ways, where people are finding a way of making sure that they are resisting anything that is being thrown at them. So to me, so far, the trip is not over. I take a lot of confidence from my time here so far, because it's clear that the people have stood up. I mean, I used this phrase today that when after a year in power, Thomas Sankara renamed Upper Volta the land of the upright people. The people have stood up, and this point of the people standing up is really all we can hope for. It's not you and me sitting in a chair talking about politics that changes the world. It's the people standing up. And the impression I have in Kenya is that is what's happening. So my message would be to those who have stood up, we salute you. And those who are thinking about it, please take the plunge. We in the continent need a strong Kenya, but a strong Kenya that is governed by the interests of its people, not the interests of its exploiters.
Thank you very much, Comrade. And maybe just to end on a much lighter and a more social note, maybe just tell us a bit of your other experiences, maybe that were not political, social, and interactions, and maybe the hospitality of the Kenyan people, in case you experienced any, because we're told that we're representing a whole nation.
No, you are. I'm not burdening you with representing an entire nation. That being said, I think that, and I do say that not politically. I mean, I arrived here at the airport at 6 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. Right from stepping off the plane, it was the kind of warmth and the welcome that I received was really impressive. So again, it is important for us to celebrate, without saying that there's some kind of universal identity of the Kenyan people or anything like that, but to celebrate the things that make us human. And that includes there's this phrase that, it has different, but in South Africa there's this talk of Ubuntu, as though
Utu in Kenya.
Utu in Kenya. Yeah. So this principle of I am because we are. It is the collective that makes the individual, not the other way around. And this is the kind of a sense one gets, not only in Kenya, in many parts of the continent. And I think that is what we have to celebrate, because really what we are saying is that we shouldn't be led to believe that saying we want things to be better is fighting for something unnatural. What's unnatural and imposed upon us is this kind of divorce between individuals. So the fact that the lady who was helping me get a SIM card at the airport was willing to spend time and to assist and to help with no expectation of any material reward at the end. It was genuinely because she said, there's a friend from another country who's here and I want to assist them. And this is what the impression I got every time we went out to eat, or we are driving on the roads, or we are meeting people. And really, I think our task has to be, again, we can sit here and have dry discussions about socioeconomic questions, but really it's about saying, let's affirm people's humanity in the way that they are already doing. And I think that, to me, has been the experience of Kenya so far. So I'm happy.
Thank you so much, Comrade. I think with that, we can end, this conversation. Thank you for meeting with us, for creating time, to have this conversation. And we hope, to have better relations with Pan-Africanism today. Thank you. And pass our greetings to South Africa when you get there.
Will do, and the honor is ours. Thank you very much.
And now, viewers, I will end this with a quote from Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And it says, "The fact of the matter is that the most profound reasons for the economic backwardness of a given African nation are not to be found outside that nation. All we can find inside are the symptoms of underdevelopment and secondary factors that make for poverty. The true exploitation lies in seeking out the relationship between Africa and certain developed countries and in recognizing that it is a relationship of exploitation." Thank you so much, and see you next time on CPK TV, The Voice of the People. I've been your host, Sefu Sanni. Till next time, viva.